Hi, folks. Just taking a few minutes to admit people as they show up, and hopefully we have. Okay, so I may be a little disjointed the first couple of minutes as folks keep joining us, but I'll try to keep my eye on the participant list and make sure that we can get folks admitted. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us, especially because with April being Sexual Assault Awareness Month, I really appreciate you making time to come to this CLE and get trained on how to better advocate for survivors of sexual assault. Some basic housekeeping. This CLE has been approved for 1 full credit. So please don't forget to fill out the survey. My colleague Yvonne is actually taking care of the chat and will be posting the survey. So please don't forget to fill out the survey because that allows us to accurately enter your information with the WSBA for credit. And it might be actually a good idea because I know we've posted the surveys before, but just click on it now, keep it open. That way, when you do log off, at least you still have the survey afterwards. I've also turned on the closed captioning. I understand last time there were some audio issues, so hopefully you can read and follow along, even if there are issues with my audio. And lastly, this CLE is being recorded, and I will share this out with attendees by end of tomorrow in case you do have to hop off early or are unable to stay on for the full CLE. So with that, there are quite a few folks coming in. So with that, let's get started. So first, I think for those of you who've already attended our past CLEs, you know this poll that we always post wanting to know who's in the room with us. So I'm going to post our question, and mainly we want to know, how are you working with survivors now? And then also, do you identify as a survivor? We'll give folks maybe another 10 seconds. Okay. So I'm ending the poll, and if folks can see, it looks like quite a few of you. I always appreciate those of you who are coming back with your experience. Quite a few of you are already working with survivors, both as advocates and attorneys. Welcome, attorneys who are new and looking to work with survivors. And I see we have a judicial officer with us, and whoever the other is, please share in the chat if you're comfortable how you work with survivors. And also just a reminder that many of us are survivors. So with any questions and comments that we have that you do share, please be respectful and be mindful of our audience. So with that, let me close this poll. And this is our intro about our program. It's just in case you're not familiar with the Sexual Violence Law Center, we're a legal aid firm of 6 attorneys. We work with survivors of all ages, all genders throughout Washington, and we represent them in multiple legal areas related to their sexual assault, just because a sexual assault really does impact so many different aspects of a survivor's life. Our model is holistic and trauma informed, and we really strive to center our advocacy in race and gender equity principles. A quick shout out to our community partners, the South Asian Bar Association of Washington, who are supporting this CLE series with the race equity, with the equity grant. And we're looking forward to any SABA members who will be volunteering and providing legal assistance to the survivors we work with. Just give me one more second just to make sure that I haven't missed anybody else who's just waiting to be admitted. Okay, so because we're talking about language, I wanted to start off with a little bit of a word association game. And I'm going to post a word, and if you can put in the chat the first word that comes to your mind when you see the word woman. And just the first word. And Yvonne, can you read out maybe a few that you're seeing?
Yeah, mom, strong, strong, thriving, wonder, friend, resilient, smart, mom, powerful, leadership, mom, life, support,
I love it. Okay.
caretaker.
So next word is, what is the first word that comes to your mind when I say safety?
Plan, home, home, plan, belonging, DVPO, fear, warm, protection,
Okay.
protection, uncertainty.
So the next word is, what is the first word that comes to your mind when I say control?
Power, fear, men, power, DV, fear and dominance, rules, manipulation, man, power,
Okay.
coercion,
And one last word. What is the first word that comes to your mind when I say the word comfort?
home, mom, safe, friend, blanket, warm, family, cultural humility, goals, puppies, safe place.
Okay. So thank you for that. The context and the meaning of words change depending on how we use it. So now thinking about the words that we just saw and the associations that you make, it can change once you see how these words come together. So thinking about what the word context, what the phrase context or comfort women means, what gun safety means, what gun control means. You know, the words associated with the words comfort and women were so positive, what we saw in the chat, but these two words put together have a totally different context. Individually, they have one meaning, but together they basically describe, and if you're familiar with the history of Japan's history of abducting, holding, and serially raping Korean women, and they use this euphemism of comfort women to describe their rape victims, victims of trafficking, and the description really doesn't convey the level of violence, the ongoing violence these women experienced in these camps that were created by the Japanese soldiers. Similarly, gun safety, gun control, essentially means the same thing, but one implies being oppressed, depending on who's using that language, gun control, and one implies security and community safety, if you think about how gun safety is used. So I use these examples because these examples show that language can never be neutral. I don't know, maybe if you can put a Y in the chat, how many of you have attended the Word Watch training that CaseArt does? Our training is very similar, except we're much more focused on sort of the legal system itself. Okay. So some of you may be familiar with this, but for those of you who haven't maybe been thinking about this, the fact is that language can never be neutral. Language, especially in our profession, language is the foundation of not only storytelling, but of the law. And as attorneys, we have linguistic power and the choices we make to describe our clients' experiences. So the focus on language in sexual assault, because I'm a history nerd, I'd like to know how this kind of research starts or how we start focusing on things. It really started receiving attention about 10, 15 years back, two specific cases that sort of brought attention to how sexual assault is talked about in the courtrooms. In the early 2000s, one was the Kobe Bryant sexual assault case, in which the defense was really able to shape the narrative and describing the victim. This was a young 19-year-old woman who worked at the hotel and had been sexually assaulted. She said that she had been sexually assaulted by Kobe Bryant. But what defense was able to do is to make it seem like she was doing it for attention, that she actually had consented to the sex, but was doing it for the money, that she regretted maybe that she had slept with him. And then they really switched that narrative, and the media picked it up, and that became the story that people knew about the Kobe Bryant case. Another example, the other case from the early 2000s was a case involving victim Tori Bowen, which was a case out of Nebraska. And in this case, the perpetrator had been criminally charged for sexually assaulting her. This was an alcohol facilitated sexual assault where she had no memory, I think, leaving the bar, and she woke up with the rapist on top of her rapist on top of her. But in court, the judge banned her from being able to use the word rape or sexual assault or any words that had any connotation with violence or non-consent. And so both of these cases kind of really got some national attention, and a lot of advocacy organizations started looking at how sexual violence was being talked about in the courtroom. And so through that process, there are many of us, CaseArc, our program, other programs, really try to pay attention and track and review language that's used in court documents and court proceedings and by parties, and try to identify where improvements can be made and where the system can really be held accountable in the language choices that they use. So kind of going back to the gun safety, gun control, word association, think about how in sexual assault, what the word accuser, like what sort of connotations do you get when you hear the word accuser or the word alleged or the word performed? So just really thinking about the impact of language. I think it's helpful to always hear from survivors themselves directly about how language impacts their experience in engaging with the system. And so this is a 5-minute video by Chanel Miller. She was the victim in the Brock Turner case. And thank you, Yvonne. Yvonne just posted the video. She was the victim in the Brock Turner case. And for a long time, people knew everything about Brock Turner, but they didn't know who the victim was. And when she finally did share her identity and speak out, it turns out that she's a writer and she's an artist. And so this is a little animated video she created to introduce her book that she wrote, I'm With You. I'm not going to play the full thing, but I am going to play the first 2 minutes.
It happened when I was 22, on the cusp of my adulthood. When you are assaulted, an identity is given to you. It threatens to swallow up everything you plan to do and be. I became Emily Doe. Assault teaches you to shrink, makes you afraid to exist. Shame, really, can kill you. Unconscious, stupid, dumpster, swimmer, Stanford, half naked, nameless, nobody. Nobody wants to be defined by the worst thing that's happened to them. I feared those words would follow me forever, so I did not speak. In court, the judge used words like moderate, less serious, to describe the crime. I remember the trial. The defense attorney stood before the jury and said, Chanel knows how you get in blackouts. You drink a lot of alcohol, and that's what she did this night, and many other nights, to be honest. So I wrote a victim impact statement, 12 pages. I read it at the sentencing, straight to the man who hurt me. You don't know me, but you've been inside me. Fingers had been jabbed inside me. My bare skin and head had been rubbing against. Who has been irreversibly hurt behind a dumpster, waiting to figure out if I was worth something. But the judge did not hear me.
So I'm going to stop it there. Chanel actually, the rest of the video then talks about like once she shared her victim impact statement publicly, the response that she got, and how those affirming words also really made a difference.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
So the reason why I like sharing this video and sharing this example is because of how explicit she is in the language that she heard describing her sexual assault and how others described her experience and how that impacted her. I think it's also important to think about, going back to our poll. We care about, we work with survivors, whether or not they've disclosed to us, and how we talk about sexual assault really informs them about whether or not it's actually safe to disclose. Because sexual violence is an invisible pandemic, we know it affects men, women, and non-binary people. 1 in 3 women will experience sexual violence in their lifetime, 1 in 6 men, and nearly 50% of transgender and gender non-conforming people will experience sexual violence in their lifetime. And that's even more exacerbated if you factor in race and other identities. Thinking about the missing and murdered Indigenous women's movement, the reason that exists is because of how prevalent sexual violence is among Indigenous women. Thinking about how Black women experience higher rates of homicide and violence than their peers. This is why it really does matter how we talk about sexual assault and sexual violence in our courtrooms and in our legal proceedings, because that is going to inform some of our most vulnerable communities about whether or not it's safe for them to get help and assistance. So the reason for the focus on sexual assault itself is that it is one of, if not the only crime where there is intense scrutiny on the victim themselves. Historically, victims of rape and domestic violence were held to a different standard than other victims. And unlike other types of injury, rape and sexual assault cases rely probably the most heavily on the narrative in the courtroom. And just kind of using the example of the phrase that I really hate, but that's often used related to sexual assault, he said, she said. You never hear people talk about he said in a robbery or a theft case or a trespassing case. And so just really kind of recognizing how much the survivor's language and the survivor's words really matter in these cases. There was a 2009 study just kind of thinking about the sort of impact language has. There was a 2009 study that tracked the sources of different news articles related to domestic violence, sexual assault cases. And they found that 1 in 5 articles relied really heavily on the law enforcement sources, and 1 in 4 articles relied on the court record. There's also a 2018 Harvard study focusing specifically on sexual violence that found biased news coverage had a very direct impact on how rape cases were investigated. Police responses were actually decreased in the communities where those news stories were circulating. And another impact, it really deterred victims from coming forward due to the fact that they were concerned about how they would be perceived, and actually increased the likelihood of rape because the language in these news stories often put so much emphasis on the victim's behavior. And so how we talk about sexual assault, how we describe a victim through the legal process really does have these long-term ripple effects and can either further perpetuate sexual violence in our communities or really help in preventing. And I think it's also helpful to think about like trauma and just how much trauma survivors we're working with are already dealing with related to all these different aspects of their experiences and their identities, and then the legal proceeding and the legal process becoming another source of trauma as well. And because I'm talking about different identities and how that affects survivors and language used to describe a survivor's experience, not only does language compound trauma, it can really perpetuate harm based on other aspects of a client's identity, particularly with women and girls of color who are survivors. They're placed at this intersection of sexual violence and structural racism. And language is used, and language can end up being used in the legal process to minimize their experiences and really attack the survivor based on these intersecting identities. And because I'm using intersectionality, I'll just quickly define it. It's a term first coined by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw about 30 years ago, describing the discrimination Black women experienced both because of their race and their gender. The fact that those identities are both so intrinsically connected. It's about recognizing that these identities don't exist in separate vacuums. So I'm not just a woman, I'm not just a woman of color, or I'm not just a person of color, I'm not just an immigrant. All my experiences are due to this interconnected identity I have. And it's meant to be an analytical tool. And I think it really helps also when we're assessing language used to describe our clients' experiences when they do have these intersectional identities, because we know how Asian women are described when sexual violence is described, thinking about the Atlanta murders and how Asian women are fetishized, or how Black women, and especially young Black girls, are hypersexualized at a very young age. So thinking about these intersectional identities is also really important in this analysis around our language and how we talk about sexual assault. And how does this play out? You know, I talked about the media and how much the media is influenced by the criminal system and the court system. So just some examples of problematic headlines describing and discussing sexual assault and domestic violence based on court cases and police reports. So this is the story. This is the headline related to Brock Turner, Chanel Miller, whose video we just watched. And this was a headline the Washington Post posted related to his finding of guilt. This is another example from The Sun. Woman drinks 6 Jaeger bombs in 10 minutes on the night she was raped and murdered. French trial on sex with 11-year-old fuels debate on consent. Did a broken heart lead Colin Kingston to kill 2 people? And then I really like this to-do list in case you need one for your Christmas shopping list. Don't become a rape victim at Christmas. So what are some patterns that you see here? If you can share in the chat, what stands out to you about these headlines? Victim blaming, yes. Thank you, V. Thank you, Jennifer. Any other patterns? Excusing the rapist, excusing the violence that's been done, a double standard, a lot of shaming language here, yes. A lack of belief of the victim, and calling rape sex, yes. Calling the non-consensual violent act something that is consensual and usually not considered violent. So I think all of you identified kind of a lot of these ongoing patterns with problematic language that we see related to sexual assault. So thinking about language to try to avoid when working with the survivor and helping a survivor fill out a petition, working with your client on drafting the facts section, or for the brief when you're starting to talk about what the client's experience was, it's really important to think about these 3 things to avoid. Victim blaming, some of you already identified that in the patterns of the headlines. Language that implies consent. I think Jen talked about calling rape sex, and then language that really minimizes the survivor, the victim's experience. And I end up using the terms interchangeably. So what does it mean avoiding victim blaming language? So this is where often there's a role reversal. The focus moves away from looking at the perpetrator's conduct, the perpetrator's actions, and really focuses on what the victim or did or did not do. Another example of victim blaming language is suggesting that the victim, if they had or hadn't acted in a certain way, they wouldn't have been assaulted. And then really conveying judgment about the victim's action. Like, you know, thinking about that headline, you know, drank 6 Jaeger bombs in 10 minutes. That really sums up what victim blaming looks like. It really focuses on the victim's conduct itself. It really implies that maybe if the victim hadn't been drinking, they wouldn't have been sexually assaulted. So implying consent, language that implies consent that we want to try to avoid. This is where often the example of comfort women, the language is euphemized, it's made softer, it really removes the violent aspect of a sexual assault, the traumatic aspect of a sexual assault. There's almost no force implied, and it really makes it seem like it is consensual. And it implies that there's mutual agreement that both parties were actually okay with what happened. And then the minimizing language, it doesn't convey the seriousness of the conduct. often this is where passive language is used. The victim was raped instead of the perpetrator raped the victim. The perpetrator, the abuser, the rapist is almost removed from the picture. And the responsibility isn't accurately conveyed. Even when the perpetrator is identified, there's a lot of focus on other aspects. You know, the perpetrator is an Olympic hopeful, went to Stanford, and doesn't really focus on their responsibility and the harm that they caused. So thinking about victim blaming language and what that looks like, this is where we're really looking at what the victim was wearing, thinking about like victim's past history, whether or not the victim engaged in prostitution, the language of accuser, alleged, things like that. I actually really hate the term the victim alleged. I just don't understand why we can't just say that the survivor said, the survivor stated. If I could, I would love to remove the word allegation from our lexicon. This is also where Damiana just said, you know, children can't consent. Exactly. And how victim blaming language seems to imply that young children have the ability to consent, like using the language of juvenile prostitutes or child prostitution. And then going back to the headlines, these are the examples of victim blaming language that we have seen pop up in the headlines when talking about sexual assault, DV homicides, and really, really violent sexualized crimes. The other example of language to avoid, language that implies consent. This is really romanticizing the sexual assault itself, using softer terms to describe a really, really violent conduct. So instead of saying, you know, was, you know, forcefully penetrated or, you know, forced his penis into her mouth, using this language of performed oral sex, using the language of fondling instead of like groping or assaulting, sexual intercourse instead of rape or sexual assault. So really, and this is language, I just also want to point out, this is language that we all learn. Growing up, we don't necessarily learn the language to describe sexual assault. We grow up learning consensual language. So it's really easy to fall into this pattern, and it's okay. It's just something to be paying attention to so that when you do make that, when you do catch yourself, you know to correct it. And when you see others making this mistake, you know to correct it as well. So really paying attention to this like consensual language to describe a very violent sexual assault. And again, examples of headlines that imply consent. In this case, you know, talking about going back to Damiana's comment, children can't consent, yet this headline implies that an 11-year-old has the ability to consent. Or that if somebody is intoxicated or potentially blacked out, that somehow they have the ability to consent. Montana judge criticized for 60-day sentence. This was a case that we had submitted an amicus in, and a response to this was, you know, there's actually a much more accurate term for sex with the preteen. It's basically called rape, child rape. And this implied, basically, the judge himself thought that the father was not maybe a rapist. And then this was a Washington Post article that about the Crystal Kaiser who killed her abuser after he had been trafficking her. And this language that they used initially to describe what he had done as sex with underage girls, even though, as you know, in the chat, it's already been indicated that children do not have the ability to consent. The third example of language to avoid is minimizing language. This is the he said, she said kind of language. Instead of calling domestic violence or physical violence, making it seem like it's a home culture, really minimizing child pornography and any sort of child-related abuse, and using language like kiddie porn, inappropriate touching instead of calling it what it is, which is assaultive contact. And I think earlier somebody had said, you know, really changing, instead of using choking, using the term strangulation to really accurately describe the violence. Minimizing language is also where we see the perpetrator being removed, where the passive language is used. Mary was raped instead of John raped Mary. So really paying attention to that. And these are the examples of headlines of passive minimizing language that really often removes the perpetrator completely or uses euphemisms to describe the sexual assault and the abuse. So we showed headlines, but there are, because they're most easily available, but these are excerpts from police reports, and actually court documents about violent cases involving domestic violence and sexual assault. And by reading these, I'm actually really curious, would you know that? So I believe that K and B were involved in a complex, intimate relationship that began as early as March 13th, 2015. Between April 2007 and May 2007, respondent R slept the night at D's home again, and she performed oral sex on him, and they also had sleep sex again, which I actually don't understand how sleep sex works. My understanding is that's actually rape, but I'd be very curious what if somebody could tell me what sleep sex is. S told her to be quiet, and then with his free hand reached under her shirt and massaged her bare breasts with his bare hand. And at the time, victim was wearing only a tank top and shorts. After a few seconds of massaging victim's breast, suspect moved his hand to her vaginal area and massaged her vaginal area over her shorts. There is a lot of massaging happening here. I'm not sure where, I guess when the investigation happened, I guess where the sexual assault itself was. But there's a lot of massaging, and I'm assuming there were like candles lit, or maybe this actually reminds me of the what is those those books that my mom would secretly buy at the grocery store and not let us read when we were younger. That's the kind of language this is, describing a sexual assault. As the oral sex was occurring, suspect took his hand and caressed victim's vaginal area. A lot more massaging and caressing happening again, describing a sexual assault. So what are some problematic practices that you're seeing in these? If you can put it in the chat. Only tank top and shorts. There's definitely a lot of romanticizing. This is a lot of minimizing. None of this sounds violent in any way. Yes, exactly, Angela. It's written in a way as if it just happened and that there's no assault at all. So this is why it's really important to think about the reality of what the survivor has experienced. And to really recreate the reality of the sexual assault. So you do that by describing what the survivor was thinking and feeling at the time, using the descriptive words that are accurate and appropriate that the survivor themselves is using to describe what their experience with the sexual assault was, documenting the entire context of the force, not just the assault itself, but leading up to the assault, because often there's coercive behavior, there's coercive conduct that is leading up to that assault that can really also help provide a context to the abuse and to the violence that the survivor is experiencing. Paying attention to the language of victim blaming, paying attention to the language of consensual sex or implied consent, and minimizing language. So one thing I do want to point out is that the survivor themselves sometimes may use consensual language when they're describing a sexual assault, because we are so conditioned to minimize sexual assault when we talk about it. Especially, for example, I think about a lot of our teen clients or younger clients. They often don't have the words to describe their experience, or with a lot of my immigrant clients, in their language. So I grew up speaking Bengali, and it wasn't until I started doing this job, I didn't know how to say rape in my own mother tongue, because that's just language we're not taught. And so sometimes we do see survivors use consensual language themselves, but that's where getting those extra details, getting context can really help in getting a more accurate description of what their experience was. Um, and it never hurts to clarify it. Like, what do you mean when something sounds consensual, but the survivor has come to you saying that they want protection or that they want to report, but they're using consensual language? Just asking for clarification and asking them, what do they mean by that? I'll use an example of a report that a client of mine made to the detective, and it ended up becoming a joint interview because I wanted the prosecutor there also, because I personally was concerned about this detective and I knew they were not going to do a good job. I also was at the interview because I knew my client would want to file a petition, and I wanted to make sure that I was using accurate language and using the same language that was going to go into that police report in that petition, so there weren't contradicting statements. And this was an alcohol facilitated sexual assault. And the client, like when she was talking about right before the sexual assault, how the respondent held her, and when they walked into the room where he ended up raping her. And just hearing that term, oh, he held me when we walked over, it would have sounded completely fine. And the prosecutor and the detective kind of glossed over, but I actually asked, when you said he held you, can you describe that? Like, how did he hold you? And then she ended up describing, well, she was so blacked out drunk, or not blacked out, she was so drunk she could barely walk. And so he actually, when she said held, she actually meant he like propped her up and kind of dragged her into the room because she could barely walk. So really getting that clarification to pay it so that you can actually accurately describe that sexual assault, it really matters. And the survivor's reality really makes a difference when you capture it appropriately and accurately. And these are some examples where survivors that we worked with actually afterwards saw the report, saw the petition, and they felt like it accurately described their experience, the violence that they went through. So I'm providing these examples because it's easy to critique, but sometimes, you want to see what examples of good writing or more accurate writing of a survivor's reality can be. And I thought some of these examples would be helpful. And I'm curious, what are maybe some things that you notice about these statements? I mean, all of them really, yes, they center the victim's experience. They really actually accurately, I think, capture the violence that the survivor was experiencing. And I think this is where also kind of capturing the aftermath to the last one. Not only does the survivor talk about being frozen, but the fact that once she was able to get away, she took a shower still fully clothed. She actually slept under her bed that evening because she was so afraid, and really capturing those details of the fear and the emotions that the survivor felt, not only during the sexual assault, but in the aftermath, to kind of really convey just uh, how violent and how traumatic that experience was. So we've talked about kind of in the courtroom itself, or preparing for court, and like before maybe going into the hearing, the kind of language you want to be paying attention to when you're working with your client on their declaration or filling out that petition, or preparing your briefing and your argument. But the fact is that in the courtroom also, that can be its own have its own complicated aspects. And yes, the majority of our work happens outside of the courtroom, but often the courtroom is where the focus on the language becomes the most intense. And there are two things I want you to think about related to sexual assault language in the courtroom. One is word bands, and the other is mirroring language. So by word bands, this is, for example, when the opposing party objects to using the term rape, or in a criminal case, maybe objects to the term victim to describe the survivor. And really being prepared, and just in case it does come out, being prepared to be able to respond. And so, for example, I would argue banning words have little impact on the respondent's rights, but can cause extreme harm to the victim. It doesn't prevent a respondent from being able to confront um, the victim. It also puts a victim in a position of perjuring themselves, because now they're being forced to testify and describe facts as the truth that do not accurately describe their experience. For some victims, they're lay people describing their own experience, and it's not a conclusion on a matter of law. And I think another argument against these types of word bans is that it perpetuates the institutional bias against rape victims. The common law, the court process for centuries have left out victim experiences, rape experiences. It was previously considered a property matter, or a family matter, or a private matter, or you couldn't be raped in a marriage. And it's only been in the last 30 years that this area of law has been evolving. And so there are definite institutional biases against victims already. And this is where we really need to be paying attention and pushing against word bans. Mirroring language is another example that I want you to, another thing just to be paying attention to in the courtroom. This is something that we can end up doing unintentionally. It's sort of our unconscious practice of picking up language and terms others are using. So for example, if the respondent's counsel is arguing and calling it a sexual encounter, and yes, maybe the first few times you object to it, but if they keep using it throughout the case, just making sure you don't pick up that term when you're maybe objecting or arguing about the assault itself, and then suddenly you start calling it a sexual encounter yourself. So really paying attention, because it's natural that we do mirror words, and that we do sort of mimic speech patterns. So it is very important to be paying attention to that sort of implicit practice that we have, that unconscious practice that we have. And then how does this apply to your work? I think a lot of it, just based on the fact that we're working with survivors, it it feels pretty obvious. But in the end, a survivor coming forward and disclosing a sexual assault, having to report to the police, describing to their advocate or attorneys, having to be deposed or testify, this is a very intense and emotional experience. And the words that the survivor uses and how those words are either repeated or glossed over or altered really impacts the way the law addresses survivor experiences. And we need to recognize that the cases that we're working on have long-term impacts, not just the immediate outcome of the case itself, but also how that client, how that survivor is responded to if there's, let's say, future abuse that happens when courts go back and maybe look at past court documents, or if law enforcement may decide not to maybe investigate as much because of the type of previous record that existed, or the prosecutor may decide based on that previous record that they just can't go forward on this case now because the survivor won't be seen as credible, or it gives opposing party just a lot of ammunition to use against the survivor. So really thinking about those ripple effects. And of course, you know, we talked about media and headlines. And so also kind of thinking about that public perception that is created through these records that we create with our clients. So we really need to be careful about the language we choose when we're talking, when we're describing our client experiences. But to end on a positive note, you know, we haven't destroyed, we haven't totally smashed rape culture yet, but the culture is changing. You know, Jeff Epstein, when the stories about Jeffrey Epstein first broke, there was all this language around alleged sex with underage victims, but that has changed. If you now search those headlines, you won't see that same sort of minimizing language when talking about these young girls that he raped and he trafficked. This was an example of the Subway pitchman headline is an example of folks really calling out the New York Times on there, how they decided to write this article about Jared, the Subway guy, raping young girls. And then the Washington Post, the Crystal Kaiser story, this was actually something that we had noticed. And then we tagged the Washington Post about their problematic headline. And within 3 minutes, they like changed their headline, which was exciting to see that the media is actually paying attention to this language. So it does have an impact, not only on our survivors, but in the larger culture itself. And that's something that we want. We want to create safer spaces for survivors to be able to come forward and know that they will be believed. And with that, I will stop it there. And I guess my question to the group is any tips or questions that haven't been answered in the chat. And especially tips, please share tips that you have, because we often don't get these spaces together to talk about how to better advocate for survivors. We do have, I guess we do have petitions we can share. It's what's complicated about it is every sexual assault or every stalking case or every DV case is just so kind of unique to the experience of that survivor. I don't know if it'll be helpful, but if there is concerns around language, I will actually mail it out with the recording of this video. There's actually a list of like problematic language and then suggested language. So we're almost at time. I'm going to keep the chat up, but I'm going to also put our program contact information up here in case you have any follow-up questions. And of course, any advocate, any attorney working with the survivor can always reach out to us for technical assistance. And then survivors, any and all survivors and their support people are also welcome to reach out to us to better learn what their legal options are and what their rights are, and if they want to engage with the legal system. Question from Melody. Yvonne, do you mind posting the survey link again?
No problem.
And with that, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you all. I really appreciate your being here, especially looking out. It's such a beautiful day. But I think this is such an important conversation we should be having. And thank you so much. Please take the survey so that I can get you your WSBA CLE credits. And hopefully we'll see you next month on May 20th. That's going to be our next CLE, and it's going to be focusing on victim privacy rights in sexual assault cases. Bye all.